Largan.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Buckingham, who I've known for nearly 15 years. He's a great friend of mine, and I know he's a fantastic champion for his constituents. And he talked very passionately about how he's standing up for them and how the project has impacted them. On the wider points he made in his speech about opposing HS2, I think that what he said was almost entirely nonsensical, and I look forward to demolishing it in a moment. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the long run, we're all dead, according to John Maynard Keynes, and that's an attitude which has been wholeheartedly embraced by many politicians throughout the years, and it's understandable why. It's all too easy and tempting to focus on the short-term, urgent political gains that can be made, and it's always difficult to spend all your political capital and indeed your financial capital on long-term strategic decisions, which you won't get any credit for, and the benefit won't be felt for decades to come. And we're seeing this short-termism hurt our country in many ways, most acutely the failure of the Blair government to renew our nuclear power stations, which we're really feeling now. And so I think that the government deserves a lot of credit for going ahead with high-speed rail, and indeed... Of course.
Mr Speaker, there might be a contrary view that sometimes people in this place decide on nice, shiny things. George Osborne liked this super-duper high-speed train, knowing full well he's not going to have to be there to implement it. It's like the government. We might say in 50 years' time we want all net zero or whatever it is. We're not going to be there. That's what's happened in this case. It's a white elephant. Come on.
Well, I'm very glad I took that intervention. I would say that perhaps George Osborne did expect to be here, but that is beside the point. Anyway, as I was saying, I believe that the government deserves significant credit for taking a very long-term decision, which I believe will be of huge benefit to the country, which they won't get any credit for a long time to come. And to contrast that with the Leader of the Opposition, who spent his first 4 years in Parliament focused on two objectives. Firstly, blocking High Speed 2 and billions of investment in the north of England, and secondly, to try and make the member for Islington North Prime Minister.
On that point,
I'll happily give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does my honourable friend think that's proof that the only North West that the Leader of the Opposition is interested in is NW1?
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself. But when I flagged this point earlier in the debate, members opposite said, this was a constituency interest, which I find a very revealing remark. It's supposed to be country, constituency, party, self. That is the priority list that a member of Parliament in this place is supposed to have. It's slightly worrying that when the interests of the country come up against the interests of a narrow corner of North London, the Leader of the Labour Party opts for self-party constituency and then country last, which I think is very revealing about his own priorities. But coming on to why this is such an important infrastructure project, and to take great pleasure in busting some of the myths which we've heard this evening. Over the last decade, there have been a whole series of myths about high-speed rail, which have been perpetuated by a combination of muddled thinking and very well-financed self-interest groups. Shall we take them one by one? First of all, we've heard it tonight, this is all about time. Who needs an extra 30 minutes off rail journeys down to London? First of all, this has never been primarily about time and journey and speed. This has always been about capacity. And if we decide to do nothing, and if we scrap HS2 today...
You give way?
I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. We never fell out when we took opposite sides in the Brexit referendum, and we won't fall out on this. But on this point of it actually of always having been about capacity, in that case, why did it have to be built as a high-speed train so dead straight that meant it had to abolish ancient woodland, go through the middle of things like the Calvert Jubilee Nature Reserve. If it was about capacity, it could have been slower from the outset and therefore gone around ancient woodland and nature reserves.
If you're going to spend billions of pounds on a new railway line, you want to make it a fast line. So that would be addressing that point. But to go back to the point I was making, if we were to give in to the Honourable Member for Buckingham's demands and scrap HS2 tomorrow, we would very quickly run up against absolute gridlock on the West Coast Main Line, which is already almost at complete capacity. Happy.
I'm very grateful. The internet's a wonderful thing, and I have just very quickly looked at trains from the member for Wellingborough's constituency into central London, and then similarly looked at trains from Preston into central Manchester, a not dissimilar distance. Should he be in the wonderful Wellingborough, he could get 3 trains before the trains close, even on a day of disruption. Well, I've just checked. And from Preston to Manchester, a similar distance, there's 1. And it's because the capacity's not there. And whilst I thought the Honourable Member for Buckingham made a wonderful speech, I think, people really need to understand what it feels like to be a rail user in the south-east of England. Would he agree with that? Capacity is key point.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and yes, capacity is the key point. She also mentioned the internet, which leads me neatly on to...
Before it moves on, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows more about Wellingborough than obviously I do, she might mention that the cattle trucks that they've now put on, since we can't spend proper money because it's been wasted on HS2, it's a great detriment to my constituents. And by the way, you can't get on Wellingborough and go north. It's a total waste. It's totally wrong. And I have to say, if there was any argument not to pass this nonsense tonight, come, my honourable friend, to Wellingborough, and then you'd be on my side. Would you agree?
Well, it gives me great pleasure to facilitate a tete-a-tete between South Ribble and Wellingborough. Back to where I was saying, the internet has been mentioned, and this is one of the most frequent, I'd say a trope of the opponents of HS2. We don't need to invest in rail because we've got high-speed broadband. Everyone's going to be working from home. We have remote meetings, not a problem at all. I would gently point out to those members that how do you deliver freight via Zoom? It's not possible to deliver millions and millions of tons of freight every year over the internet. And that is just completely misses the whole point. Because we desperately need to be moving away from road haulage and on to rail freight. That is one of the big benefits of this. It doesn't just open up capacity for passengers, it opens up capacity for rail freight too. And I'm very proud to represent a large number of quarries, and I'm the chairman of the APPG for mining and quarrying. And one of the big challenges is getting all of the aggregate out of our quarries and onto site. And at the moment, a huge volume of that is done via road HGVs, which causes huge problems across the Peak District. And being able to increase that capacity is a really big benefit of high-speed rail. And it's come on to the point of cost. It's always been mentioned. The cost of high-speed rail is absolutely astronomical. It's completely ridiculous. It's a white elephant. So let's just take the opponents of HS2's worst-case scenario cost figures for HS2, which, by the way, I think are massively inflated. But let's take them at their word. How much would that actually cost when you spread that out over the lifetime of the project, decades? We're looking at around, even the worst-case scenario, around $5 billion a year. That's half of what we spend on overseas aid every year. When we're talking about a huge investment to upgrade the most important railway line in the country, spending 0.25% of our GDP a year over several decades doesn't seem to me a disproportionate amount of money. Next, another one of my favourite myths. HS2 is bad for the environment. I remember in the last one of these debates, the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion referring to High Speed 2 as environmental annihilation. I'm not sure if she's ever been to Kent, where High Speed 1 exists. It's still the Garden of England. Some of the opponents, you wonder whether they've ever seen a railway line. We are not talking about 8-lane superhighways. We are talking about relatively narrow footprint, and we're also talking about beautiful pieces of infrastructure. I would very happily invite all of those people to places like New Mills, Chapel Milton, where you have stunning viaducts crisscrossing across a national park, no less, which are beloved parts of the landscape. Next, it's a false choice. We should be investing in local lines, not spending billions on this big infrastructure project. That's just a completely false narrative. Big part of opening up this capacity helps existing commuter lines. High Peak is the perfect example of this. Commuters on the Buxton line from places like Whaley Bridge, New Mills, Chapel on the Frith, Buxton, heading into Manchester. That is a really poor service. Why? Because they have to go through the Stockport-Piccadilly corridor, which is one of the most congested lines anywhere in the country. There's not enough space on that line to get a more frequent and more reliable service into Manchester. Opening up HS2 opens up the Stockport corridor and will allow for a more reliable and a more frequent service for my constituents. And next, we are also doing all the investment in the local lines too. The upgrade of the Hope Valley line in my constituency, the £137 million upgrade, is under construction already. The HS2 Minister came recently with me to see construction progress. That is also going to make a huge positive impact on commuters in my constituency. And again, it's going to open up freight capacity to help get goods out of the quarries in the Peak District and through into market. Yes, I'd like to see us go even further. I'd love to see us upgrade the Glossop line as well. I think there's some really interesting proposals to go for a double track beyond Broadbottom to Glossop and to improve signalling on the way into Manchester Piccadilly, which I think could open up even more improvements on what is one of the fastest growing, busiest commuter lines anywhere in the country in Glossop. That would be fantastic too. So, having gone through a number of the myths in relatively quick fashion, let's have a look at what we're talking about tonight and this Crewe to Manchester Piccadilly leg. Because I do think that it's really important that we get this right. And a number of members opposite have talked about Manchester Piccadilly Station. And I do agree it is absolutely essential that we do get this right. It's going to be huge sums of money. It's an opportunity to dramatically improve one of the key stations, not just for Manchester, not just for people in High Peak who commute in there, but across the entire north of England. This needs fixing. And I do think that it's important that we do explore all the options, including an underground line.
Well, I thank the honourable member for giving way, and it's good to see with some consensus on that. As the honourable member powerfully said, actually, in his speech, that it's not a trade-off between a national project and local services and facilities. Indeed, at the moment, my constituents in the north, which part of my constituency, would love to have the promised 2 trains an hour, but because of the lack of capacity in Manchester around there, it just can't happen. So that's where the government ministers need to focus a little bit more energy and actually invest to ensure that this project lasts for generations.
I'm grateful for his intervention. I know Northwich very well. In fact, I used to work there. And again, HS2 opens up huge opportunities for his constituents. So I'm really pleased that after my discussions with the HS2 Minister, the instructions to the Hybrid Bill Committee allow them to look into all options at Piccadilly. I think that's really important. They also need to look into all options at Manchester Airport. A few people have talked already about making certain we get that right, having the proper Metrolink and rail and bus links too. So lots of work to be done at the next stage of this bill. But I'll conclude by saying that high-speed rail and the government's wider £96 billion investment in the rail in the north of England isn't just good for the environment, it isn't just good for the economy, it isn't just good for jobs, it isn't just good for the High Peak, it's good for the whole of the north of England and it's good for the whole country. Let's get on and build it.